Welcome, everybody, to a very special episode of Legends and Lectures. Somebody I've wanted to have on the program for a very long time, and I'm so glad we finally got him. The lovely, the wonderful Duncan Mackay, who's going to talk to us today about a subject that I love very much, about Boudica and Iron Age Brits. So thank you so much for being here. Will you please tell everybody who doesn't know you about your work and give yourself a little introduction?
Right, yes. I'm a field archaeologist by background. That's what I did for 20 odd years. So very much digging. I'm not really an academic. Um, then I left digging archaeology to be a stay-at-home dad for a few years, and then took the opportunity while I was doing that to start researching and traveling and writing a book that I wanted to write my entire life. And always wanted to walk into a bookshop and find because I'm quite lazy and I didn't want, it'd be great if somebody else had done all that work for me and I could just pick it up and read it all and know what all the archaeology was and where I had to visit to get close to these things. No one ever did. So I researched and traveled and wrote a book about Boudica, which has been a lifetime obsession of mine. And I first planned traveling around trying to investigate it. Oh, I should think 20 or 30 years ago now, and just never ever got around to it. So finally, opportunity knocked, and I did it, and it resulted in Echolands, a journey in search of Boudica.
And that, I mean, as you can, for those who are watching, obviously the book is right here. But the book really does read like a travel log, but it is kind of a mix, I would say, of historical background, travel log, because you do talk about the only sources that we have talking about Boudica, and you follow the Tacitus, so you follow you and to an extent Cassius Dio, you follow the Tacitus and go along her story and really try to map out where Boudica was and what happened. So I just want to ask you quickly about your first book, because this is not your first book. This is you did a work called Borderlands, I think, and or something to do with the Borderlands.
I did. That was an academic publication. That was for Cambridge University when I worked there for the archaeological unit, with Chris Evans, who was the director at the time, and Leo Webley, who was an Iron Age specialist. So I was a co-author on that, and that was completely unlike Echolands. It was very much an academic publication. I like to think it's a very good one and a very readable one. But that's covering the archaeological work that I directed in South Cambridge around the Addenbrooke's landscape, which resulted in a huge amount of Roman and Iron Age archaeology, a remarkable landscape, which I managed to mention in Echolands as well, because it's right next to a very important road in Echolands. Yeah.
So, in the book, speaking of Echolands, you write that archaeologists dig up people and stories. So, tell us the story of Boudica and her people.
The story of Boudica and her people really comes historically rather than archaeologically. There are archaeological stories to tease out of it, but we're very reliant on two authors, as you said, Cassius Dio or Dio, whoever, and Tacitus. We have two accounts by Tacitus, one of which is rubbish. That's his biography of Agricola, his father-in-law. He hero worships Agricola. And the later part of the Agricola is what is great, and it's much more important, and it covers Agricola in northern Scotland, and that's how we reconstruct that. But it's a bit about Boudica's rubbish. Mostly we rely on book 14 of the Annals, and that talks about Boudica's war in great detail. Boudica, as far as we know from what he tells us, was not a queen in her own right. She seems to have been a queen consort. She was married to a man called Prasutagus, who was named as king of a tribe called the Iceni or the Iceni, inhabiting what is now modern day Norfolk, North Suffolk, East Cambridgeshire, that sort of area in East Anglia. When the Romans invaded, they made peace with the Romans. When the Romans came in AD 43, they didn't fight, and they became what we call a client people, a client tribe. Just to put in straight away, tribe is a problematic word to be using in relation to the peoples of Iron Age Britain. But for me, it is about probably the best modern word to use
Mhm.
rather than just saying states or peoples. Um, they remained a client tribe. They rebelled very briefly in AD 47 when they were disarmed by the Romans, but it seems to have been a minor affair and Prasutagus remained in power. But in AD 59 or 60, Prasutagus died. He left a will, a very Roman thing to do, but he left a will that left half of his wealth, his estate, his kingdom, whatever, to the Roman emperor at that time, Nero, and the other half to his daughters with Boudica, two daughters. So at that moment, they're the important ones, they're the embodiment of the tribe. The Romans aren't having any of that. They come in to dispossess them. Boudica is flogged, the daughters are raped. So that both on every level, as far as the Iceni are concerned, that's not just a crime against the girls themselves, and they probably were girls. They seem to have been quite young. It's symbolic of the attitude towards the entire tribe. The Iceni rise up in rebellion. The tribe called the Trinovantes to the south of them rise up in a rebellion with them. They've been very badly treated as a conquered people, and they march on the most prestigious settlement, Camulodunum, modern Colchester. They wipe it out. A part of the Ninth Legion is sent from the Midlands to try and stop them doing this. They're wiped out. Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman governor, is currently campaigning in Anglesey, and he marches back with his army. He gets to London ahead of Boudica, but retreats. Boudica destroys London. She then goes north and destroys Verulamium, modern St. Albans, and at some point after that, there's a cataclysmic battle in which Boudica's army is wiped out. And at some point, either in that battle or very soon afterwards, Boudica dies.
So let's talk about how true any of this story is. First of all, I think it's interesting how, I mean, we really don't know much about Boudica, as you say. We don't know how old she was. We can take some guesses. We don't even know if that was her name because Boda means victory in Old Celtic. So we have no idea. Both Tacitus and Cassius Dio or Dio spell her name differently as well. We don't, something I think is interesting. I don't see many people asking about. We don't know if Boudica was part of the Iceni tribe because she was married to Prasutagus, and we don't know if she was Iceni or Iceni herself because it's interesting that in his will, when Prasutagus dies, and we don't know why he dies. We don't know if somebody kills him or he's just dead or illness that he doesn't leave his things to her. He passes it on to half to Nero and half to his daughters. Also, I think it's worth mentioning that when Rome showed up in Britain, he was not the person who was in charge of the tribe at the time. He came in charge. He was in charge a little bit later in 60 AD. When Rome first showed up, it was somebody else who was part of the tribe.
We don't know that, I would
Oh,
say.
okay. So do we
I
not
would
know that?
No, we don't know that. So the a lot of that uncertainty comes from the coin evidence. So
Ah.
the Iceni produced large numbers of coins, particularly silver coins, but they also produced gold coins. And when you get into the first century AD, you start getting names on them. Now, we don't probably won't go too far into this. It's a bit of a wormhole to go down, but there is a coin that says Presto or Isu Presto, and that has been argued that it's Prasutagus. Perhaps it's a misspelling of Prasutagus. Maybe he was Prastotagus, but whatever. You have a very Romanized Iceni coin, and most of them aren't, but this is a very Romanized Iceni coin with the name of Presto on it in a part of the country at a time when we know there's a client king called Prasutagus. It's a big coincidence. Not everyone's convinced by that, but I generally am. But there are quite a few other names as well. Um, there's Arle Scarvo and Isu, and there's all these different names. So the theory for a long time was that maybe one of these other kings was in charge when the Romans came. I would perhaps take the stance. This is almost fiction. We don't know, but I would guess my best reading of it is that when the Romans invaded, the Iceni there was different septs or parts of it. Maybe clue to that is Caesar 100 years before mentions a tribe called the Cani Magni, the Great Iceni.
Hmm.
So you could be seeing there are different parts of the Iceni, but there may have been two or three different kings at the time or rulers of the Iceni at the time the Romans invaded, but the Romans only like to deal with one. they like to conglomerate these things and have a client state with one ruler. And that might be when Prasutagus is actually raised to kingship, or great kingship, high kingship, whatever. But yeah, we really don't know. So I would actually guess Prasutagus seems to have been in. Tacitus says he's had a long rule, so
Okay.
I'd go for that.
Is it possible that Prestigious is a title of some kind?
Yes, very
Okay.
much so. Yeah, it could be a religious title as well. I think it's. I think people have interpreted it as sort of chief priest or something. But yeah,
It's
so
interesting that you say that because I've seen people say that Boudica was they claiming that she was chief priestess or probably some kind of priestess to Andraste, but we don't know that really. We have no idea.
no, it's speculation. A lot of the story, to be honest, is speculation. And if we say anything more about Boudica than that she was married to Prasutagus and she had two daughters and became the figurehead for a rebellion, we're really going to quite a grey area because it's we're kind of guessing and we're kind of going for best guess and saying,
Yeah, I mean,
well, probably.
Cassius.
Interesting. Interesting you said about the fact she might not be a Caney at all, and that's absolutely true. She might not be. She could have married in from the Trinovantes or from anywhere else. So it's, yeah, we know nothing about her. I reckon, as I speculate in the book, the most likely age range for her is her mid-30s, but she could have been anywhere from her mid-20s to her late 40s, really.
Yeah, I mean, as well, if she is a queen consort, because she is not a full queen, if she's her contemporary to the north was a full queen, but she was not a full queen. Were those really her daughters, or were those Prestigis's daughters from some other marriage? But anybody's guess, really. I mean, Cassius is the one who tells us that she was wearing a torque and that she had long hair and that she had a terrible voice, etc. But we don't know that. He never saw her. He didn't.
No, he's nicked that from a couple of earlier writers describing Gallic chieftains, and he's very slightly feminized it. So
So what else can the archaeology tell us about her tribe, and Roman Britain, and in the area at the time?
um, for the Iceni, it's quite interesting. You sometimes hear people say there's nothing particularly archaeologically distinct about the Iceni. I don't think that's true. I think they are quite archaeologically distinct, um, particularly from the tribes to the south and the west of them. They might share some similarities with the Coriol Torvi of the Midlands. There could be an argument for that. But for the other tribes, south and west of them, I think that they are archaeologically distinct. And one of the great archaeological distinctions is the fact that they're not being particularly, it's not a great word, Romanized, but they're not being particularly hugely influenced by Roman goods and prestige goods and pottery. Um, Prior to Boudica's rebellion. So all the other tribes are doing that even before the Roman conquest. And certainly after the Roman conquest, and particularly the other client tribes, they're getting injections probably of imperial wealth, whether they want it or not, and whether they think it's a gift or, as far as Dio Cassius tells us, they actually they're loans and they're recalled, which is part of the reasons that they rebel. But um, the other client tribes, very quickly begin developing towns, and they're swamped with Roman pottery and Roman goods and things. The Iceni aren't doing that. There's very, very little Roman pottery and material in Iceni lands archaeologically before Boudica's rebellion. There is some. It's certainly not a blanket ban, I don't think, but I think they're culturally conservative, and perhaps they are trying to cling on to something. But in that sense, they are distinct. Also, you start getting continental style burials creeping into the southeast. Both before the Roman conquest and certainly after it. And again, you're not really seeing that in the territory of the Iceni. So yeah, I think they are quite distinct. They tend to live in unenclosed settlements. They're not surrounded by a big ditch, a lot of them, even though you do have some big earthworks in Norfolk. The normal settlements just seem to be these big spreading things that take up miles and miles of landscape, but they're not very well defined. And that makes them quite difficult to spot archaeologically. I think we probably have seen most of the big ones, either by aerial survey or by indeed artifacts turning up. They are quite artifactually rich. But there'll be many, many more smaller settlements or farms or whatever that we haven't found yet. But yeah, they're certainly there as a people. and particularly with their, I think, with their coinage. They're one of the few tribes whose coinage does generally seem to stick pretty much within the tribal boundaries. When you look at the distribution of Acadian coins, they do kind of sit within Acadian territory. With a lot of the other tribes, they're all over the place. There's a cluster towards the tribal area, but they go out elsewhere. So no, they're interesting archaeologically.
What about their fellow uh, tribe mate? What about the Trinovantes?
The Trinovantes, they're pre-conquest. I think we know a lot more about the Trinovantes again from their coins and from the history because they're mentioned by both Caesar and then they're mentioned by Cassius Dio and, or sorry, Dio. I'm one of the few people in the world that says Dio, and everyone else says Dio, but
It
I
does.
can't
It
I
does
can't
it.
get out of the habit. Um, I think Dio mentions them, Tacitus mentions them, so we know probably quite a lot about them compared to the other tribes uh, historically. But it's interesting, the century between Caesar and the conquest is interesting with the Trinovantes, in that the assumption from both the accounts and from the archaeology, particularly the coins, is that the Catavalorni, who are just north of the Thames, in what is now with Heartlands in what is now Hertfordshire, they are clearly bullying and trying to take over the Trinovantes prior to the Roman, prior to Caesar being there.
Mhm.
Caesar kicks the Catavalorni back into their place and makes them promise they won't attack the Trinovantes again. But during that century, the Trinovantes seem to be taken over by the Catavalorni, really massively dominated by them, and Colchester, Camalodunum, is taken over as a Catavalornian capital rather than a Trinovantian one. So when the Romans invade in AD 43, they're attacking what seems to be an alliance between the Catavalorni and the Trinovantes, but it's probably just the Trinovantes fighting because they have to, perhaps. But when they're beaten, the Trinovantes are then treated as a conquered people. So after the conquest, Tacitus is quite explicit. The Trinovantes are treated as slaves. They're kicked off their farms. They're taken as slaves. They're treated abysmally. So when Boudica rises in rebellion, they're absolutely up for it as well.
Hmm. Well, her greatest claim to fame, her big first claim to fame, is that she, as you say, she burned down Colchester, which is one of the main Roman settlements, with the temple to Claudius at the time. And so I think it's Tacitus who says that there were 200 Romans in there without swords who were waiting for her. Why they were without swords, I guess, because of the religious aspect of the temple. But we have no idea how many people were with Boudica at the time. But then there was a 2-day siege until Boudica's people took the temple and then burnt it down together with their Trinovanti friends. So tell us what the archaeology says about that event and about the temple and about Colchester in general.
Mm. Well, it was an undefended city. The it had started off as a great Iron Age center. When the Romans came, they plonked a legionary fortress bang on top of the highest point where Colchester, the city, now stands. Um, it's interesting. I think the 200 unarmed men were the men that when Colchester was threatened by Boudica, the colonists sent to London, or sent to the procurator for help, who was probably in London, and all he's got are these 200 badly armed or ill-accoutred men. I would suggest they were probably, possibly, legionaries that had been long seconded to the procuratorial staff, and therefore weren't battle accoutred anymore. They probably hadn't got a lot of their armor. They'd lost half of their javelins and things, and so they weren't very well armed or organized, perhaps, but we don't know. But when there was a fortress of the 20th Legion, they marched off to fight on the Welsh front in the terrible guerrilla war taking part in what is now Wales in AD 49, and it then became a city. They founded it as a colonia for retiring veterans. They were clearly completely at ease there, didn't see any threat from the local population, so they didn't. It wasn't normal for early Roman towns in Britain to be fortified, to be perfectly honest, even though Tacitus, with hindsight, says it was a terrible thing to have ignored. Roman towns generally in Britain weren't fortified at that
Hmm.
period. Um, But crucially, because the colony is going to be bigger than the old fortress, they build over the defences of the fortress. So there aren't really any defences there. But it is settled by Roman veterans, which Tacitus says are specifically done to guard against revolt in that part. They're older men, but they're still hard men. They've had 25 years of army service. They're very experienced. And presumably, even though they whether or not they've retained their own arms, there are arms that they can draw upon. They can't get, there must be some sort of armory, even if they don't have their own weapons anymore. Um, Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to act as a line of defense, as Tacitus says. They don't evacuate the city, and I think that's partly because they are cocksure and arrogant, and they don't think that these people that they see as slaves and have long been disarmed will really be any match for them. I think it's when Boudica's army comes in within sight, they realise that it's just they're going to be overwhelmed. There's nothing they can do, and they anchor their defence on the temple complex. Now, that's what Tacitus tells us. Interestingly, there's not much human bone from this event found in Colchester, for the simple reason that although Boudica destroyed it and there would have been thousands of dead, they were cleared away. The city was rebuilt. So they wouldn't, any bodies that they could see would have been cleared up. What we find are the scraps and fragments of the ones that weren't found, that a burnt building collapsed on them or whatever. But most of those finds, most of those bits of bone, they all concentrate in the north, get me east and west correct, the northeast portion of the city where the temple was. So that does sort of in some way support the idea that they were using the temple as a compound, the temple complex as a compound. I don't think they fell just back onto the temple building itself. There would have been a large temenos around the temple, and although that would ultimately in the later city be surrounded by a huge colonnaded walkway, we don't think that had been built that early in AD 60. But it would have been, the perimeter would probably have been defined by something that's a natural fortress and strong point, really, to get all of these thousands of people to take shelter in, while the soldiers and whoever else try and hold the perimeter. After 2 days, it is the Britons get in. The archaeology is fascinating in Colchester. I could talk about it for hours, and obviously we don't have that time. But everywhere you dig in Colchester, where the old Roman colonia was, it's this enormous deposit of burnt material is there. You can get down onto the floors of houses that were burnt. There's all the personal possessions. It's very, very remarkable and quite affecting. And you can, although there's none of that actually open for the public to view, in Echolands, I identify points where you can go into the city below the level of the city and where the archaeological digs have been, and you can kind of imagine what was there. Crucially, though, you have the Temple of Claudius, and for a long time, nobody actually knew where the Temple of Claudius was. It had been mooted that the Norman castle sat on the top of it, but there was no proof of that. An archaeologist called Mortimer Wheeler went down there in 1919 or 1920 into these supposed dungeons underneath Colchester Castle, took one look at them and said, "Dungeons be damned, this is a Roman temple." And it was the underbelly of the foundations of the Temple of Claudius that sat on this great podium that the Norman castle now sits on. So it's again a remarkable place to visit, because we have the chilling account of Tacitus telling us that the last stand of the rebels, of the colonists, took place there, and that they were all killed, they were all slaughtered, everybody died. And if you go into Colchester Castle, on the ground floor, you are effectively walking on the ground floor, on the ground surface of the Temple of Claudius. So you are in that space almost, with those people just 2,000 years later. So Colchester is a place where you can really get to grips with Boudica's rebellion more than anywhere else. I think it's quite an affecting and quite an intimate experience, I think, if you go there with all that in mind.
So Paulinus, who was the governor, Paulinus Suetonius, who was the governor of London at the time, he ends up leaving Wales, and he cobbles together about 10,000 men to try to uh, quell her rebellion. And so it claims that he got her between a valley and a forest. And do we actually know, though, if how Boudica's rebellion was formed. Do we actually know anything about their numbers or anything about the archaeology of how this came together? Because you talk very briefly about this, but then you go deep into the archaeology of where the last battle might have happened. So do we know anything in that in between time?
Yeah, the what's interesting, we don't know whether Tacitus ever came to Britain. It's always said he didn't, but
Hmm.
someone has made a very, very interesting case that he might have come to Britain because Agricola was his father-in-law, and
That's right.
Agricola became governor of Britain later. And when Tacitus became when Agricola became governor of Britain, Tacitus had just married his daughter and would have been at exactly the right age to come and do his early military service. And the Romans did that sort of thing. It was all very much sort of, well, you're my son-in-law, you come and I'll give you a good position on the staff, sort of thing. So it is possible. Um, but irrespective of that, his account, when you plonk it onto the map of Roman Britain, if you open up an Ordnance Survey map of Roman Britain, his account fits onto it beautifully. Boudica is in what is now Norfolk. She travels down and hits the nearest town, which is Colchester. They then move on to the next one, which is London. They then move up to St Albans. It works in a very good way. Paulinus is up on Wales and comes down what would almost certainly be Watling Street to London and then retreats. You can fit it all on the map very beautifully. And the bits where we're uncertain, for instance, where the Ninth Legion marched from and where they were wiped out, you can make quite a good guess for something like that by saying, well, we have a fortress of the Ninth Legion of the right period that would house the right amount of troops here next to Peterborough in the Midlands, and there's a road directly from there to Colchester. Let's look along that road, and this is a good place for an ambush. We don't know that's where it took place, but that's a reasonable thing to play with. When it comes to Boudica's final battle, despite the fact that he does give us a vague topographical description, which is that Suetonius picked a position that was backed by woodland, so he could not be outflanked from behind, and the Britons were forced into some constricting landscape feature, presumably a valley, that would channel them towards him. That means that her numbers, however many they are, and Dio Cassius puts it into this sort of 230 odd thousand sort of area. I think Tacitus is much more conservative. But their numbers can't do anything but play against them in this battle because they can only meet Paulinus on the front he presents.
Hmm.
The fact that Tacitus says he's got 10,000 men, again, fits incredibly well with what we know of the garrison of Britain. We know that the Second Legion are down in Exeter and they don't come to the battle. We know that the Ninth Legion have been mauled and are hiding in their fortresses. So he's got the 14th Legion and part of the 20th Legion and auxiliaries. If we look at the legions and the units as they would have been probably under strength because they've been campaigning, he's perhaps got 5, 6, 7,000, 6,000 legionaries, perhaps 4,000 auxiliaries. It all fits very, very well. So I'm not doubting the Roman numbers on that. With regards to the British numbers, all we can say is that Tacitus says that 80,000 Britons were killed in the battle and everybody on the battlefield was killed. That's probably a gross exaggeration, but it's difficult to reconcile his account with the events if we say that there weren't 30 or 40,000 Britons at least who were killed in that battle. And we've got to remember when Tacitus has Paulinus says there are more women in their ranks than men, he may actually not be referring to female warriors, much as I believe that there were female warriors in the Iron Age. I think Tacitus might be meaning there for Paulinus to mean there are as many non-combatants as there are warriors. This is a huge, looks like a huge army, but thousands of them are in the wagons. They're the kids, they're the women, they're the elderly, they're the non-combatants. They're not the people you're going to be fighting, but they will die ultimately in the battle. What we can say is that Tacitus gives us a very detailed account of the rebellion. It takes us to Verulamium and then just stops.
Hmm.
He says that they get to Verulamium, Boudica destroys it, and then Paulinus broke off delay and fought a battle. For me, that says he's given us the theatre of the war. It's all down in the southeast. He's taken us to Verulamium, and he hasn't told us about any other towns that have been destroyed. There are burning deposits west of London, but they could be associated to that year. They might not be, but they could be local insurgents. They could be war bands. They could be whatever. But there's no reason to move the whole of Boudica's army and Paulinus west of London. I think that's a complete red herring. The favoured candidates have always been up in the Midlands. This was kicked off by Graham Webster and Donald Dudley in 1962 when they published a book about Boudica, which was the first attempt to really place the archaeology and the accounts together and put it together for a story. But they placed it 75 miles north in Warwickshire at a place called Manchester. I don't think anybody who seriously looks at the story and the archaeology nowadays would give that very much credence. It's just too far away. I mean, how are these armies feeding themselves, particularly Boudica's?
On rage.
Yes, well, yeah, absolutely. Adrenaline and rage and anger, but and Celtic fury. But a few years ago, an old friend and colleague of mine from Cambridge, Graham Appleby, published a paper which he proposed another battlefield along an ancient trackway called the Icknield Way. Very, very interesting paper, very influential paper. And I think what was most influential about it was that Graham emphasized the importance of this ancient trackway called the Icknield Way, which cuts across Britain about 10 miles north of Verulamium and leads directly back to Norfolk. So it's the road home for these people. This is not a professional army. They're not even really warriors anymore. There's hardly anybody actually fighting in that army who will have much memory of life before they were ruled by the Romans or they were a Roman client state. They'd been disarmed 15 or so years before. The kids haven't grown up training properly with weapons, raiding, getting experience of war. This is not an experienced army in that sense. They're farmers. And they've had a hard war. They've defeated nearly a half legion in the field. They've destroyed 3 towns. They took the heavily defended Temple of Claudius. They've taken a lot of casualties. And they're going to be really struggling to feed themselves, especially after London, because Paulinus will have destroyed all the food in London. He'll have destroyed all the food in Verulamium and probably any food lying between the two. And this is not an army with a commissariat. You could almost look at it. It might look a bit like a migration. So I can't see them trundling for miles and miles and miles in any direction. And I think Paulinus doesn't want that. We need to lose the idea that's been perpetuated for so long that Paulinus is running scared, that he has to find this perfect. He's got this tiny army of 10,000 men. He's got to find this perfect battlefield. 10,000 men is quite a Roman army. It's the size of the Roman army that conquered the entirety of the southwest of Britain, which was some of the hardest fighting of the early conquest period. He's not running scared. He wants a battle. He needs a battle. He can't. She's effectively taken the province from him, and the longer that goes on, all the other client tribes that haven't joined her are going to be wondering whose side they ought to be on. So he needs a quick battle. So I would suggest it's close to Verulamium. That's what Tacitus is telling us. Dio Cassius confuses it by saying that he delayed the battle to a more convenient season and when he was running out of food. The problem is, I don't think that I've always taken that as being completely contradictory to Tacitus, and it does allow people to say, that means he could have retreated to North Wales or he could have retreated up into the Midlands. I think Dio is probably just garbling it a little bit. He retreated from London. He was delaying battle to a more convenient place or time. He probably was running low of food. He'd left his commissariat and all his logistical bases, campaign bases up in North Wales. So his men have got iron rations, and they might have managed to get a bit of a stock from London and Verulamium, but they probably are running short of supplies. So Tacitus says they broke off to lay and fought a battle. Remarkably, right next to Verulamium, about a mile to the southwest, you have a hilltop position backed by ancient woodland, as it still is now, and it would have been then, that sits at the top of a shallow valley that runs down to Watling Street, which would have been Boudica's line of march up from London. Now, that's interesting in itself, and I think it's in landscape terms alone, it's easily as good as any site that has been proposed as the battlefield purely on topography, because every other candidate has no other evidence for it except the topography. Remarkably, at the top of that defile, exactly where you would plonk a Roman army if you were trying to defend the heights, there's a huge scatter of Roman army lead sling bullets. Roman battle artifacts are so incredibly rare in Britain. You occasionally get evidence of fighting on hill forts in the conquest period. Classic site being at a place called Burnswalk in southern Scotland, which again has loads and loads of Roman army lead sling bullets. But if you take hill forts out of the equation, it's so rare to get Roman battle artifacts. You get an occasional sling bullet here or there, but to get a cluster of them, there's only one other, and that's in the Lake District. I think coincidentally, to say that this is the ground zero of the search area where we're looking for the biggest battle the Romans ever fought in Britain, you have a landscape that matches Tacitus. It's a landscape that Boudica is in, and you have this scatter of battle artifacts. For me, would make it the most compelling contender that we so far have. Boudica and Paulinus aren't the only candidates who could have fought there, but because of where it is in the southeast, there are really only three contenders. One is Julius Caesar in 54 BC, who we know he goes north of the Thames into what is probably now Hertfordshire. I think this particular site is a bit far west for Caesar. It's never been one of the favoured candidates, but the possibility of it being Caesar is undeniably exciting. It could be Caesar. It could be in AD 43 from an unrecorded battle during Plautius's invasion in 43. Mm-hmm. The problem with that is archaeologically, we have no reason at all to think that any fighting took place in that area. That part of the Cativalorni seemed to have capitulated very quickly and seemed to be favoured by the Romans. They very quickly, Verulamium becomes a chartered town in Municipium, and the local people are buying into that. It could be an unrecorded fight from AD 43, but with no reason to assume that it is. For AD 60, we're looking for a battlefield, and she was there. So I would say it's a great candidate for the final battle.
So when do we dig a trench? When are we putting the trenches in?
It is farmed land. It's been very heavily metal detected, and that's the reason we know the slingshots are there. We know of about 120 that have been recorded. Anecdotally, there are probably many hundreds of more that have been found that haven't been recorded, but the heights certainly have been very heavily metal detected. And I was there a year or so back just before Echolands came out, going for a walk, and there was a metal detectorist going along the valley who I had a chat to. It's interesting, actually. If that is the battlefield, it would cover a vast area, much bigger than the hilltop position where those slingshots have been found. But interestingly, because it is a valley, over the last 2 millennia, there will have been quite a lot of soil creep and soil wash. So if there are battle artifacts in the valley bottom, a lot of them may well be below a detectorable level. So a trench, which I often would say in a battlefield was pointless, might actually pay dividends somewhere there. But as to funding it and getting the permissions and organising it, I'll leave that to someone else. I think.
Let's do it.
I'm working on another book now.
I was going to ask you about that afterward, but let's find out first. So, what did happen to Boudica? Because Tacitus says she poisoned herself, probably didn't, and Cassius, who was not there, gives a different description. So, is she really buried under King's Cross?
Yeah, King's Cross. Well, that was based on the fact that somebody suggested the battle took place there, you see. Mm-hmm. So there have been a lot of candidates in the past. So King's Cross was almost called Boadicea's Cross. There you are. I think the fact that we only have 2 accounts of her death and they both are different would suggest that they didn't know. Yeah. That would be my take on it. That they either didn't know how she died, never found her body, whatever. I think we'd have a more detailed description if they certainly didn't capture her. We'd know if they'd captured her. I think the assumption was that she died. if she was on that final battlefield, I find it very difficult to believe that she escaped.
Mm.
Um, and I think I think it would be very likely that she would have committed suicide on the battlefield, or have had somebody kill her rather than be captured. I mean, if you take another example from the Dacian Wars, when Decebalus is going to be captured, he's being chased through the woods after the catastrophic battle, and he manages to cut his own throat before he's captured. I think most leaders at that time would have done anything to avoid capture and defeat. Worked out all right for Karaticus, but I think Boudica wasn't going to get any favors from them. Yeah, so yeah, we have no idea. If she died on the battlefield, I would speculate what little remains of her is scattered across that field in just outside St Albans
Yeah, I mean,
somewhere.
both Tacitus and Cassius Dio never saw her, so we don't even know. They maybe the legions didn't know what she looked like. Have no idea.
Exactly. Yeah.
Uh,
It was, yeah, very much so. I mean, it's that classic scene at the end of Spartacus, isn't it, when they've searched the battlefield and can't find him, and they, it's like they just, there's so many dead. I mean, even if we halve Tacitus's number and say there's 30 or 40,000 dead on that battlefield, in the chaos of all those wagons and horses and oxen, and Tacitus says they're all killed as well in the frenzy.
yeah.
It's a bloodbath. I mean, how are they ever going to recognize anybody? And there will be other high-ranking people there wearing gold talks and things. So goodness knows whether they ever found her. It's
There's
vague enough that you can make up any story that you want to about it, isn't it? So, and especially with the daughters, we have no
yeah, what
idea.
happened to them? We don't
So
even know.
they're not mentioned again. So the wonderful author Elodie Harper is just, her new book is coming out this month called Boudica's Daughter, and it's about it's a fictional take on what happened to one of Boudica's daughters after this. And I think that has always been a great draw for novelists, because obviously we're not told that the daughters die, and we have no idea what their fate was.
Yeah, we don't
Again,
even know if they get the throne. There's no record of them after that. We have no idea if
No, I
they actually
mean, yeah,
inherited.
we have no idea. I mean, certainly, I don't think they inherited. I think the Iceni were very much a subject people after that. But yeah, did they survive? Did they survive openly? Did they survive covertly? Were they killed? Perhaps, as most likely on the battlefield when Boudica died. But yeah, lies with so much of the story. It's just such a great unknown.
Speaking of which, there's some I've seen there's a great fashion now for people thinking that maybe she never existed at all because her two chroniclers never met her. And as we say, we don't know what happened to her. We don't know how Prasutagus dies. We don't know what happens to her daughters, if her daughters were actually her daughters, and and after that. There are some people who think that her story is really just a riff on the rape of Lucretia and other classical stories because it does follow very similar beats. And there are some people who think that she was just cobbled together from other figures like Cartimandua. So I guess there's so
As you may imagine, I have a great issue. I have many problems with those suggestions. It's interesting. We do now have what are debatably coins of Karaticus, but I've never heard anybody question Karaticus's existence. Calgarcus in Mons Graupius, the Caledonian leader, he's probably a more sensible person to question because he's simply brought in to make a speech, and that's it. You never hear anything about him before or after. But the Romans undoubtedly knew who the leader of the Caledonians was, and Calgarcus is a perfectly good name. I think it means the swordsman or something, doesn't it? So I think that they know nothing about Calgarcus, but I think a figure called Calgarcus existed. But to call into question Boudica, who is named in three separate texts, the first one only less than 40 years after her death, when lots of high-ranking important Romans would have been serving in Britain at that time and would have been at the peak of their power and influence. Why would he jeopardize sullying the memory of Agricola in that biography by completely making up the early part of his career and what happened? I think then to move on 20 years later to draw on the same fictional character to build this really detailed narrative about would be absolutely absurd. And I just genuinely don't think Tacitus could have gotten away with it. it's not inconceivable that she wasn't the only leader. But I think the fact that she is specifically named would mean that we'd have to have some pretty good reason to question that she was the prime leader of that rebellion. But to question her existence, I think is bizarre, really bizarre.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Um,
For my money, I don't think there's any reason
yeah,
to believe
but
she's
it's
innocent.
interesting what you say about drawing on other stories to create the story. That is interesting because, of course, the somebody leaving half of their estates to the emperor, to a bad emperor, is something that Tacitus tells again for someone else. He tells it for Agricola. So when Agricola dies, he leaves half of his estate to Domitian, another bad emperor. Um, and then Tacitus makes the point that Domitian thinks this is absolutely brilliant, not realizing that only under a bad emperor would a good father leave half of his estate to the emperor. Now, is he making the same point with Prasutagus, that he had no idea whether Prasutagus left a will to the bad Emperor Nero, whether he's just using a trope that the Romans would recognize, that Prasutagus was a good man doing the best for his family, that Nero was a bad emperor, or conversely, was leaving half your estate to a bad emperor such a common thing that Prasutagus really had been advised to do that. And they're the sorts of things we simply don't know. That part of the story could be fiction, the same as the part of the story about the beating and the rapes could be fiction. You could question, actually, who would have recorded that, and who would have known that, and how would Tacitus have known that? Who would have fessed up to that in the aftermath of this catastrophic revolt? I think it probably is true, but it is also plausible that Tacitus by then is drawing upon his knowledge as an experienced middle-aged Roman who's been in the army, who's been in provincial administration, he's seen how local leaders are treated by the army and by these administrations. He could just be making up what was a typical situation that could have inspired the rebellion. So there are all those question marks hanging over the accounts. I think he is broadly telling us the story in that part as he understood it. But it's certainly a second tier of evidence where he's deliberately playing us and getting us on side there. So yeah, there's all these questions that we will never answer.
We'll
We will
never
never.
know. Unless we got
Yeah.
to dig a trench, and then we'll know. In your book, you specifically, I noticed that you refer to Boudica and just her people in general more as Britons more than the Celtic peoples.
Mm.
Do you think, I mean, obviously there are problems with using the word Celtic when it comes to things that are not archaeology and not language. Do you think we should stop using the word Celtic in favor of poss using Romano-British or Briton?
I've never had a problem with the word Celt and Celts and Celtic. I think it is useful on a broad scale to say whether you're talking about Romans or the Greek world or the Germanic tribes or the Celtic tribes. I mean, there's certainly, we're looking at language and art and culture, there's certainly a phenomenon that I'm happy to call the Celtic world. Um, I actually went to university in Sheffield in the early 1990s, and my Iron Age professor was John Collis, wonderful man, who at that time was quite sort of skeptical of using the word Celtic. But I always found it useful as long as it's not used specifically. I think when it comes to Iron Age Britain, I think it's pointless saying Celtic. Um, because you're going from the very broad to known areas and peoples. So with regards to Britain, I'll say yes, it was a Celtic culture, but beyond that, I would never refer to them as the Celts and the Romans. I'll say the Iceni and the Romans, or the Silures, or the Caledonians, or whatever. There's no need to use that general term. And I think yes, if you're talking about just the people who inhabited Britannia at the time of the Roman conquest, Britons. So I've been pulled up before on social media for saying British in that context, but I think that's probably probably getting a bit pedantic. I would say British war chariots, as opposed to the chariots of the Britons. But but I think you can get bogged down in terminology. It's the same with whether you use tribe or people. Obviously, the Romans don't say tribes. They talk about, but you could interpret as, I suppose, as peoples or states or whatever. But should we call them kingdoms? Should we call them kings. Should we call them petty kings? I think just use a term which is reasonable. And although tribes is undeniably problematic, for me, it's still, I think it still summons up the picture that in most people's minds that tribe, when you say tribe to people, the sort of idea they get in their head, I still think that works very well for Iron Age Britain. I like it. I do persist in using it. I know some people are a little less comfortable with it, but I do. But yeah, Celts in a general sense, yes.
You have the very famous statue of Boudica on your book, those who are looking. What do you think really is Boudica's legacy, and what do you wish more people knew about Iron Age Britain?
Oh, the first bit is probably easier than the second bit. What I wish more people knew about Iron Age Britain. I think I'd have to go. I'll answer the second question first. I think in that sense, the art. I think Iron Age art is just knocks the socks off anything the classical world was producing at the time.
I
Um,
agree, yes.
I mean, that's not to say that classical art isn't, jaw dropping and incredible. It's realism, which for me in the ancient world is less interesting, but it's stunning and it's very accomplished. It's extraordinary. There's strokes of genius in it, no doubt. It doesn't do it for me in the same way that Celtic art does it for me. Iron Age art, particularly what we call Latin art, particular style of art, and then you have different branches of it. So you talk about insular Latin art in Britain. It's mesmerizing. It's clever. It's funny. We don't understand a fraction of it. We've lost that cultural lens to do so, and I don't think we'll ever have it. But you can play with the coins, you can play with the shields, you can play with all the mirrors and all the different styles, places where you get this artwork. And every time you look at it, you see something different. And I think some of it you'll see a face spring out, a smiling face, an angry face, a clown face. And I think for a lot of the time, people just thought, well, that's just coincidence. It's just your brain is making those dots up. But I think more and more it's becoming recognized that these are deliberate hidden faces, and there's all sorts of hidden imagery. It's wonderful. It's just endlessly beautiful and fascinating. And I think when most people think of Celtic art, they think of knotwork, which is later. It's not
Yeah.
really Celtic artwork. Go to Iron Age artwork and look up Latin artwork, and I don't. There's nothing to my mind ever been a more sophisticated, clever artwork than anybody's ever produced. It's just absolutely stunning. So that's what I wish more people knew about the Iron Age. I could rattle on about hill forts and all sorts of things, but they're kind of what people think of for the Iron Age. Where perhaps look at a piece of art and then just zoom in and just follow the lines, and you can stare at the smallest piece of art for hours. You just get lost in it. It's wonderful. Boudica's relevance or her legacy. Her legacy on Roman Britain was probably not very much. It was the last gasp, the last hurrah of resistance, proper resistance in the southeast of Britain. The problem with it we have in saying that is that the by far the best recorded bit of the Roman occupation of Britain is the early bit, when the conquest is going on. After that, we lose almost all history, almost everything. So we're reliant on the archaeology again. In the reign of Hadrian, London is burnt down again. And that's very suspicious. It coincides with hundreds of skulls being deposited in the Walbrook Stream in London. It's rebuilt with a fort. So we've started to talk about that as the Hadrianic War, but we have no idea, even if there was a war, who the participants were, what it was about. But I think as big rebellions against Roman rule go, you could say Boudica's was probably the last in the southern Britain in many respects. You could argue that the Norfolk and the landscape of the Iceni remains a backwater and underinvested and everything. That's debatable, and it's argued. And I think it probably was a little bit thrown by Boudica's revolt, and I think the reverberations in East Anglia perhaps went on quite a long time. But as a whole, I don't think it had any great impact on the longevity or the how the rest of Roman occupation played out very much. When she's rediscovered, she's an enigmatic figure in the Renaissance. both a love and a hate figure. Some of the interpretations of Boudica are very misogynistic, and they don't like her at all. They like the Romans, and so they don't like Boudica. She becomes a huge figure in Victorian Britain, but of course, as I always say, hugely problematic for the Victorians, because the Victorians are at the height of their empire, which they've based pretty much on the Romans, and they're out subduing peoples across the world. And the beginning of that statue, Thomas Thornycroft's statue, coincides directly with what we variously call the Indian Mutiny, the Indian Rebellion, the First War of Independence in India, which erupted in 1857, I think. That's when the statue started. And so modeling this native ruler who's kicking back against the world's greatest empire and massacring all these people and almost kicking them out, that's really scary for the Victorians, because that's exactly what's happening to them in various bits of the globe at that time. So they don't really. There was the poem which is inscribed on the base of that statue is Thomas Cooper's poem, Boudica an Ode, and it says, "Regions Caesar never knew, thy posterity shall sway." The continuation of which is, "Where his eagles never flew, none invincible as they." So it's this clarion call to the destiny of the British Empire, that she went down fighting one empire, but it's her empire that will come up next. They turn her into an imperial icon. It's a terrible thing to do to Boudica, absolutely dreadful thing to do, but she took on that role. The more interesting role, and this is what I always talk about, the far more interesting role that coincides with that is the rise of the women's suffrage movement. Mm-hmm. And Boudica's statue in its final bronze form goes up in 1902, which is the last year of the Boer War, the height of British imperialism. It also coincides with the great rise in the women's suffrage movement, and a year or two later, I think, the foundation of the Women's Social and Political Union. And the women's suffrage societies start using Boudica's statue as a rallying point opposite the Houses of Parliament. This great warrior rebel woman. It's absolutely ideal for it. They're actually then banned from going into anywhere near Westminster, so it becomes an illegal place for them to gather. And the WSPU produce a beautiful little silver brooch of the statue, which I have two of them. I treasure them. They're two of my most precious.
That's amazing.
Treasured items.
They're originals.
Yes, they are.
Wow, that's amazing.
They're the only two that I've seen in person. I've seen another one on the internet that belongs to somebody else. But yeah, they're quite rare things. They actually sold them in the WSPU shops, but they're very rare things to find. They're beautiful. It's a stunning little one. I wish somebody would. It'd be really interesting to try and get somebody to make a reproduction of it. The original company who made them are still in existence, but yeah. So she became a great icon for the suffragettes in that sense. And I think that's the point, is that her great legacy for me is that she has become a figurehead, a natural figurehead for anybody kicking back against something. So the environmental movement has also used it. She's been taken up for children's books and things now as a sort of anti-bullying figure. And, some of her victims in Colchester and London might take issue with that. But I think a lot of people seem to be put off Boudica. They say, oh, yes, but she had a good reason to rebel, but she killed lots of people and she massacred everybody in Colchester. She would have been an extraordinarily unusual ancient commander had she done anything different to that. Yeah. And she had no control over her army. But even well-disciplined, really well-disciplined, professional modern armies, in much more recent historical times, when they capture a city, often become completely uncontrollable and destroy it and treat the civilian population, who sometimes they're even meant to be liberating, terribly badly. It's a sad fact of war. So I think it's difficult 2,000 years hence to be too hard on Boudica for just doing what every other commander of the ancient world, including the Romans, habitually did when they went into cities. So yes, a brutal commander, perhaps a pitiless commander, but she has become a figurehead of someone who will kick back. against something that they perceive to be wrong, or just somebody who's been pushed too far. And for me, that's her enduring legacy.
Echolands, A Journey in Search of Boudica, not Boudica. That was a spelling mistake. But I absolutely love this book. Thank you so much. You can
Thank
see
you.
I've been very careful and I've not dog-eared it. Instead, I've just marked it with non-sticky paper. Thank you so much for agreeing to be here. I really love this book and I treasure it very much. So tell us quickly, what are you working on next?
Ooh, well, I won't say
If
too
you're allowed,
much,
if you're
but I
allowed.
won't say too much. I've signed a contract to write a new book, which
Yay.
covers very much, but I suppose really picks up where the end from the end of Echolands, from the aftermath, the terrible, terrible aftermath of Boudica's rebellion, and follows the Roman army northwards through to the end of the Roman conquest and the occupation of the north of Britain, and what happens basically after Boudica.
So please wait, whenever that's finished, whenever it's out, please come back and please tell us about it.
I will. It's due in a year's time, so my mind is on other things at the moment. Rather than Boudica, I'm afraid. But yes,
You
I'm.
have so much time. You have so much time.
Oh, I wish I felt that. I wish I felt that.
Well, thank you so much for giving us so much of your time. We really appreciate it. And
Well,
thank you
thank
so
you for
much for
inviting me. I'm sorry it took so long for us to get around to this. This was originally meant to happen in January, I seem to recall, and then somehow didn't, and then it was meant to happen in July, and then yes, but we got here. So yes, thank you very much for having me on.